again, it's episode 436 of This Is Whole Life. And this week, we go into a question in our Great Question series. This was the absolute last question. So if you've missed the first two, well, just swipe up in today's show notes, go back a couple episodes, and make sure you catch them, because I think each of them this year were really tough. And yet this one, I think, was maybe not as tough, because I think Ken mentally could have probably not done a ton of prep for this and probably been able to answer most of it, except for the fact that like this is a message you don't want to miss, for sure, because there's too much to go back and go through it all, because then we'd be like an hour and a half. Because Ken gave a really nice it was like and Lucas did a great job with the graphics. It had almost like a blackboard feel, like, okay, on this side we're going to list these, and on this side we're going to list these. So we're going to have this comparison. We're going to have this opposition. Why is one different from another? And it really was, for anyone that's ever asked this question, why is there a differentiation? Oh, no. What is the question for this? Why did I miss it? Here it is.
You got it.
That was right. It is, why do Seventh-day Adventists teach the observance of Seventh-day Sabbath and not of the Old Testament feasts and festivals? And so a lot of people might just stop at, well, why the Sabbath? Because we're like, wait, the only time we've ever heard of the Sabbath is a few short references in the Bible. We've never observed the Sabbath. Maybe we don't know that much about it. So that part, but then why not the feasts and festivals? Because this seems all like Jewish culture, so why wouldn't we just all lump these together? So if this is one that maybe you have talked with a friend or someone about in the past and maybe not explained it as well as Ken, I'm raising my hand here in the studio because this is something that I think if you're an Adventist and you have friends outside the bubble, they want to know. And I think this is about as good or as complete an explanation as I've heard for it. And there were some things that I didn't know about Judaism, where much of what we, what we believe, things come from is, we owe a lot, like Ken said, to Judaism through this. And even though I knew we had differences in beliefs, I also didn't know some of the different parts that we didn't know. Like I didn't know, and I just want to start with a question, because this one was the one that started from the beginning. You mentioned that from a Jewish perspective, the Ten Commandments are the same as the law. It's just all the law.
Yes.
And we're like, no, we think those are different.
Right.
The ceremonial law in the law of Moses versus just the Ten Commandments, even though there's some crossover there, right? Why did they not see it that way? Is there something specific that it was just like the thing that's been eating at my mind the whole time, and it may not be the most important one, but it's the one that's been just.
So I definitely want to qualify this with, I don't consider myself to be a
Jewish theologian,
Jewish theologian, or even remotely close to an expert on Judaism. So what I'm going to share with you is information that I've gotten from some of the rabbis that I've had a chance to chat with over the years, and then research that I've done of my own. So just qualify all of that. Just my understanding is that within Judaism, basically everything that's handed down by God on Mount Sinai is just a part of the law. They don't draw this big distinction between the Ten Commandments and then everything else that's given, which as Protestants, Seventh-day Adventists, we do. We draw kind of a distinction between the Ten Commandments and everything else. But if you read through the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy, Leviticus for that matter, it really is one long explanation from God of what He kind of expects out of His nation.
Long is the key word in that phrase. It is a long,
and yet for most Jewish children, they memorized all of that.
All of it, yeah,
mm-hmm. Yeah. And so really, when we read things like the psalmist saying, "Thy word have I hid in my heart that I might not sin against you," he's most likely referring to the entire law, not just the Ten Commandments, but all the law that's handed down on Mount Sinai.
So then, what does the Ten Commandments become in that? Or am I getting that wrong?
I think that the distinction that as Christians that we make is it does seem that God, He writes down these 10 commandments on stone. They are stored in the Ark of the Covenant. And we view those 10 commandments, those 10 commandments really summarize everything else that's there.
Yeah. Okay.
And then Jesus summarizes it even further when he's here on earth by saying, basically, you can reduce the commandments into two things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Love your neighbors yourself. And you can see that in the commandments, the first four.
Sure, yeah.
As probably many of you have already heard this. The first four about what it means to love God. The remaining 6, what it means to love other human beings. And so as Christians, we look at that and we think, you just look at those 10 commandments and they are, it's hard to say that there's a single one of them that doesn't have application today. Most of us, just don't want to be murdered or see other people be murdered. And, we all have an agreement that taking things that aren't yours without permission, not a good thing. Now, as I talked about in a sermon a while ago, there are cultures where there's different ideas of what's common property and what's not.
That's interesting.
But even within most cultures, there's some idea of what it means to take something that doesn't belong to you, and what it means and that sort of thing. So, across the board, I think, again, we'd agree that it's probably good not to have any other gods before the only God.
Yeah.
Not taking God's name in vain, that we talked about that back in the 10 Commandments series. So, and then to the question of this week, the Sabbath, and I think that my main argument this week, and somebody asked me, well, why didn't you get into Colossians? Why didn't you there's a text in Colossians 2, there's Hebrews talks about this. And so, well, why didn't you kind of unpack that? And I said, well, good question. Those are, very relevant passages. But we have about 25 minutes. And on either one of those passages, you can go down a lot of rabbit holes on how you interpret that. And I think the main question for me is, do you really think that the purpose of the Sabbath has been accomplished? Do you think it's not necessary? Do you think it's just something that we can move on from? And, I have some friends that will say, yes, the purpose was accomplished. Friends outside of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
How would they, just to that point, how would they say that it's been accomplished?
They would say that Christ is now our rest.
Oh, okay.
That because he accomplished with his death on the cross, that he is now our rest, that there's not a need to keep a specific day. They would argue that the seventh-day Sabbath was for Jewish people, part of that law. And it's interesting, across Christendom, there's different levels of discussion on the Sabbath. So there's the Seventh-day Adventist camp that says, look, the seventh-day Sabbath, sundown to sundown, Friday night sundown to Saturday sundown, that is the Sabbath, and it remains, and its purpose has not been fulfilled, and we need to keep it. That's the camp I fall into. And then there are others that say, look, Jesus accomplished the purpose, and so the Sabbath is not necessary. It's you should keep the Sabbath, but it doesn't matter what day you do it, because the seventh day is really more about Judaism than anything else. And as Christians, we're not restricted to a certain day of the week. We ought to take a Sabbath. We need to do that. And then there's those who altogether say, hey, no need for Sabbath whatsoever. If you want to keep a Sabbath for your own, edification, by all means, go ahead and do it. But there's no purpose behind it. You don't have to do it. There's not a reason. And I hope that I was pretty clear in my sermon. For me, Sabbath is just one of those huge gifts that God gives us, and I really sometimes just fail to understand why. If somebody hands you $100 bill, why you don't want to go ahead and just reach out and take it.
It's like when you're a kid, you're like, man, now that I'm an adult, I wish I would have taken some of those naps.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And And for me, the Sabbath is, it is just this massive gift that God has given to humanity. It's just this thing where with I haven't always been a pastor. I've worked in outside of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and for me, the biggest gift in that situation was just saying, "Hey, look, I'm not available."
Yeah,
and it was nice. It was really wonderful, and yeah.
But what about the people that, I've heard this one a lot. How do we know that Saturday is still the same Saturday or the same day of the week as it was, even if we're going to go along with what you're saying?
Yeah.
How do we still know that that's it? Or that actually, before, I've heard this one too, that there's, and I have this one, I have no idea, that the used to be 8 days to a week. There's a camp out there for that one too. So I think there's
and the world is flat. And,
I don't know. I don't know. I haven't looked at that. This one was a recent one that someone told me that they.
I haven't heard that one, so okay. I'm not really prepared to comment on an 8-day work. Well, yeah, I guess during the French Revolution, they tried to have a 10-day work week.
Yeah, I think the calendar is what really comes into.
Yeah. So here's there's a lot of math which I'm no good at.
Yeah, Melanie, where are you today?
Let me just put it this: the easiest way for me is, what do people who practice Judaism worship on?
Saturday.
Okay. And how long have they been doing that?
Since the beginning of time.
Since Mount Sinai. And they've been very careful about that, and they've paid attention to it. It's something that's mattered to them. Like I said, my friend Rabbi Saul, he said it's not so much that the Jewish people have kept the Sabbath as the Sabbath has kept them.
Okay.
And he said, it's, if you've ever, just one of my favorite quotes, he said, just if you've ever really kept the Sabbath, truly kept it, you never give it up for anything, because it's so beautiful and so meaningful when you properly keep it, observe it, and enjoy it. And so for me, the uncomplicated way of knowing which day is the seventh day is just looking at what the Jewish people do, because they've been doing it since Mount Sinai. They've been very meticulous about being sure that because it matters, and they pay attention to that. And from there, I can also infer that that on Mount Sinai, God told them, this is the seventh day. He reaffirmed that if there was any question in their mind. And it's really a fascinating thing when you think about the seventh day Sabbath. Science will tell you that our body operates on a 7-day rhythm. It just genuinely does. This is, outside of biblical. And why is that? Why would we operate on it has nothing to do with the stars, has nothing to do with the moon, has nothing to do with our planet going around the sun. This 7-day week, where on earth does that come from? And the Bible offers the explanation that God created the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh day God rested, and that God literally at the very beginning set our bodies up to run on a 7-day rhythm, 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. And that our bodies just function best just on a physical level, and and we're not even talking about the spiritual elements, which are, in my opinion, more important. But it's a beautiful thing, and I love reading books from people outside the Seventh-day Adventist faith that talk about Sabbath and just the importance of it. People outside of Judaism that write books on this and have found the Sabbath to be beneficial to them. And for me, when I look at why keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, well, because that's what God asked. So that's the way. I can celebrate my anniversary on any day of the year I want to, but there's one that my wife really appreciates me celebrating it on.
I bet you appreciate that too.
And I did, which it's just good for everybody.
It's good for everybody.
And same thing with your birthday. You can celebrate your birthday on a different day. And my son's birthday is coming up this Friday, and he's not going to be with us. Thanks, Hurricane Milton. But he's going to come back God willing, the next week, and we'll celebrate it a little bit later. But I'm still going to call him on his birthday and we're still going to tie. It's his birthday, and God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. And that's what we celebrate with the Sabbath, that we were created, that God created everything that we see, and that we are grateful for that. And we recognize that we can rest because God's fully capable of doing things way beyond our imagination.
Is there any text in the New Testament that says that we can, rest on any given day?
Well, depends on your theological bent. So depending on how you choose to read, there are. I think one of our online viewers brought up the text in Colossians 2:16 through 17. It says, "So don't let anyone condemn you for what you eat or drink, or for not celebrating certain holy days or new moon ceremonies or Sabbaths. For these rules are only shadows of the reality yet to come, and Christ himself is that reality." Now, Adventist theologians who are far smarter than me have taken that text and explained how Seventh-day Adventists view that. And again, I'm going to simplify this, but basically that when it says Sabbath, it's with a lowercase s, because all the holidays, all these feast days were called Sabbaths. They were days of rest.
Gotcha.
And so there's the Sabbath, capital S, like Seventh-day Sabbath, capital S, and then there are other Sabbaths, lowercase s. And so Adventist theologians argue that this particular verse is not talking about the Sabbath, it's talking about Sabbaths, like feast days and that sort of thing. And so that's one argument. And there's a lot more nuance to it. And like I said, I don't want to take away from there's a lot in there to unpack. But if you're asking why do some other Christians say that? Well, that's one text that would give them that. It also in several places talks about the early Christian believers meeting on the first day of the week, which isn't really, for me as a Seventh-day Adventist apologist here, it's not really a problem. I mean, we meet on Wednesday nights for prayer meeting, within the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Oh, yeah.
And we will have meetings sometimes on Sundays, and when you come to church isn't indicative of what day you keep holy. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? And I think that's one of the problems when we reduce the Sabbath to attending church.
Yeah,
that's problematic, because coming to church is a part of observing the Sabbath, but it isn't observing the Sabbath. It isn't the whole of.
It's not mentioned like, hey, get together corporately together as a body of Christ,
right?
In the commandment. But I also hear what you're saying, because I never realized growing up Adventist in the Midwest how many other people really did know about the term and about what it was about Sabbath until we moved to Orlando and we went to a Bible study fellowship, which I really enjoyed. It was a really cool group of non-denominational, and everybody welcome. You're just not supposed to tell everybody what your denomination is throughout the course of discussion. And of course, we get to this, and the guy was like,
"Tell me without telling me."
It was on Moses. The year we went was. We were studying Moses. Well, obviously, you're going to come to Sinai and you're going to get all this. You're going to get the 10 Commandments. And it was really cool how many people, I would say, and this was just a men's group. I think we had 12 in our class, 10. And I would say 80%, somewhere in that, were keeping a Sabbath, but they were keeping it as Sunday. And of that, probably 50% were keeping it as an Adventist would keep Sabbath, where it's like, the guy's like, man, once I found out about the Sabbath, man, it messed up everything. Can't watch football. My wife is like a hawk. I can't, I put a TV out in the garage. I'm going to go work. No, I can't get away with it. And, kind of half joking, but like, he's like, I don't cut my lawn. I cut that on Saturday. And so, people, I think we like to think that this is just an Adventist thing, but there's a lot of people who are searching for that, and they read about it and go, man, that sounds really, really good. So I think, to your point earlier, Ken, the invitation to, and the quote you said from, I think you gave one of your friends, like, hey, once you have it, like, why would you ever give it up? And I heard that being spoken just like you would assume anyone that you grew up with would think about it. And even from being away from the church for a long time, it was still like, jobs and things like that. Like, I don't work on Sabbath. I'm not saying I was any kind of a Sabbath keeper. Please don't confuse that part. But like, I wasn't going to go to work on it, and it was going to be my day to overall relax, unwind, do whatever it was I was going to do. And so I think that's the other part. I just feel like people really are searching for something with as busy as everybody is. And then the other one, the first time I realized, and I don't know, I was reading through, it was Easter, and there was a discussion going on. It was probably Facebook about Easter Sunday and why everyone's going to Easter. And one of my friends was like, and he was raised Catholic. They came to the church through a seminar, and we were good friends through grade school. We were in business together, longtime friends. And he's like, man, you Adventists. He's like, I don't get you guys. You don't go to church on Sunday to celebrate the Jesus, rising. And he was kind of, back and forth. We've discussed this a lot, so it was all in good fun. And I went back and read the Easter story, because I always did feel a little bit like all of my friends, we grew up in a very large Catholic community. It seemed like we were missing out on the whole Easter thing. I felt like that was me. And so when I went back and read it, it hit me for the first time that when Jesus died on Friday before Sabbath, and he honored his Father resting on the Sabbath as, pointing back to creation. And that to me was one of the things that really made me never question, just personally for myself, just not to question the Sabbath legitimacy again. It just, to me, that's really beautiful. When you think about creation and God has this perfect plan, it all goes awry. He sends his son, and even in this plan that nobody really wants, but it has to be this way, and the sacrifice is made, and still he rests on the Sabbath. I just to me, that just makes my heart warm and smile every single time that I think about it. So that's always been, since that time, that's been really, really precious to me. And then I feel like once, we were talking about the feasts and the festivals, I thought there was a lot of interesting information that I didn't know about the feasts and festivals. So please don't miss this episode, because I thought it was really, really laid out well, looking at creation, looking at, what happened at Sinai, and pointing to Jesus and all the different things that came through why we do and why we believe this way. And it was the parts that really made me think about was, I know people that will say, well, and I want to get to this one first. This is a question, and let's see, who was, Trafina. Trafina, we've missed you in the question series for a while, and we happened to jump over to Facebook just to double check to see. And Trafina asked, is Sabbath keeping a salvation issue? And this is the one I feel like always comes back to, this is something that we believe that people can feel like they're excluded somehow because they believe it's a salvation issue, or some believe it's not. So what do you think?
Well, what saves a person?
Well, Jesus saves the person, the sacrifice.
Okay. So
Ken's smiling at me. I'm not sure.
So I always ask people two questions when I baptize them. Do you love Jesus with your whole heart? And is it your desire to follow Jesus wherever Jesus leads? And to me, that's the key. Is Jesus said the great commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Mm-hmm. Love your neighbors yourself, which is part of following Jesus, in my opinion. And so what it comes down to, in my opinion, is a love for God that causes you to follow God where God leads you in your life. And so that's why I want to answer that question very carefully, because the Sabbath is this beautiful gift. And it's this opportunity follow Jesus into rest. And so I guess my question back to Trifina is, where is Jesus leading you? And are you following?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I always felt like, too, that there's a coworker of mine had this question, and I was totally unprepared to answer with anything I felt adequate or felt equipped, because I'm not sure that, there are people that I've heard very succinctly, like, this is black and white. This isn't a question. Why are you asking? You know better. And then the answer that I more fully see myself following and believe is what Ken just said. And yet, and I think if you approach it also with someone who's searching, it's an answer that first off, I think is correct, but then it doesn't hold such a cloud of, well, you better make a decision right now, because what if this really is something that, maybe Randy doesn't understand, and he's telling you this, but maybe he is right. What if he's right? And it created it was one we had to go back and forth with multiple times, because I didn't feel like I approached it the right way. And it's hard when people ask that question to be loving or to explain it in a way that's loving, but the way Ken just did, I thought was really good.
I guess one of the things you could say is, if you don't celebrate your anniversary, does that mean you're not married?
Well, there you go.
Well, not necessarily, but it could be indicative of some major problems in your relationship if you're not celebrating it. If there's no joy when you come up to your anniversary, that could be a sign of that sort of thing. And at the same time, I don't want to denigrate many good Christians who just haven't heard God call them in that direction.
In that way,
mm-hmm.
Lucas, just really quickly, congratulations on the half marathon this weekend.
Thank you.
Big congratulations.
he's looking a little stiff this morning, but he looks good. He's got good colors.
I survived.
I survived.
I swam across the lake.
Yeah, did you?
Yeah.
Did you do you did?
The open swim.
Yeah, I'm still, I think I'm going to have to, I was Freuded out. I said, maybe I need to get a nose plug. I was like, I need a nose plug to swim. And I'm like,
maybe
I got a little congestion for the last 2 days. And I'm thinking maybe that nose plug is a good idea.
You did the whole...
went out and we... Freud and myself and Carla Menier went, because I think we're all planning on trying to do a triathlon here shortly.
Ouch.
And so they wanted to do the lake swim, and man, I got out there. I love swimming so much. It's like, I'm no good at running whatsoever. I'm mediocre at biking, but I can swim. I can swim.
He's like, this is where I'm making up my time.
Unfortunately, it's right at the beginning of the race, so you really don't win a race by doing well in the swim, and especially when you got to make up the time especially somewhere. When you do poorly in the run.
It's the tricky part about triathlon is getting your body used to, getting out of the water. Transitioning to one.
Oh man,
to another. Yeah,
well, but Ken, he's long and lean, got those long arms, big cups.
Yeah, well, what Lucas was saying though is it feels when you get out of the water and you get onto a bike, there's this little bit of transition between the two. Mm-hmm. And for me, even worse is the bike to the run. Yeah, because your legs, you've already been using your legs on the swim. You use your arms mostly, and just a small. I only do just a small flutter kick on the swim, because you want to save your legs for the bike and the run. And but man, going from the bike to your legs have been doing circles, and then now you're trying to get into stride, right? And so,
well, it'll be interesting. When's the event coming?
You know what? I need to actually sign up still. I've been kind of dragging my feet a little bit. I'm like, I think I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it. So,
you're going to do it. Okay.
I'm going to do it. Nice. So I think it's at the end of October.
Well, maybe we'll have to let everybody know when this is, and we can come out and cheer our faithful.
No need for that.
The whole life faithful.
No. I mean, I don't want to take that away from Freud and Carla, but please don't do it for me.
Nah, we'll come about the run part just to cheer you on and help you.
Yeah, I don't think it's legal for you to carry me though.
Well,
I don't think that's included in the package.
We'll see if it's CCTV on the course, and we'll act accordingly. All right. Maddie asked, would sin be defined as transgression of the law as listed in the Ten Commandments, or the ceremonial law, or is it both? Something I've always wondered about.
Yeah, good question. So, obviously, breaking the law, the Bible talks about that being sin. And I feel like Jesus really did a good job of talking about this topic, because he basically says to the Pharisees and to his disciples, and when he's talking about this topic, he says, look, you guys are too narrow in your definition of sin. You think that by just keeping the letter of the law, that somehow that you're okay. Mm-hmm. He said, but it's so much more than that. It's what's going on in your heart. He says, if you look at another person with lust, then you've committed adultery. If you hate someone, then you've committed murder. And so Jesus just magnifies what's really going on. And sin, in simple, the simple term means to miss the mark. And what's the mark? Well, Jesus said, loving the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself. So anytime we miss the mark on loving God and loving others, well, then there's sin going in our life. So, yeah, I mean, if you commit adultery, you're not loving your spouse. You're not loving somebody you've made commitments to. If you steal, you're not loving the person that you stole from. If you take God's name in vain, you're not loving God. So those are all ways of falling short of the mark. And when you look at the ceremonial law, there's parts of that still have application today. Some things that if you do those things, they can be hurtful to God, in your relationship with God, and hurtful to other humanity. And so those are the things to think about. I don't think that necessarily we need to keep the part of the Levitical law that talks about how far out into the wilderness you have to walk to dig a hole to use the bathroom, because that was kind of had to do with cleanliness in that time, and yet still sanitation matters in the world that we live in. You don't want people urinate or defecating in the streets. It creates disease and problems like that. And so it turns out God had a lot of really kind of useful information for the people in those places. And I know that there's stuff in there that good people agree or disagree on whether it still has application or not. And again, this is where Paul says, let everybody be fully convinced in their own mind of what they're being asked to do. But if you believe it's wrong to do, then you shouldn't be doing it. Mm-hmm. And Paul talks about that. So I don't know if that completely answers the question. I'm pretty convinced that all 10 commandments still matter.
Yeah.
I'm less convinced that the aspects of that ceremony, what we call the ceremonial law, still matter.
Well, Anonymous had said, if Adventists don't honor those commands given during the Exodus, why do they pick and choose other Levitical laws to maintain? But I think what you just said really kind of answers that.
Sure. I had somebody after church ask me, I thought it was a really good question. They said, okay, so what about, why do Seventh-day Adventists make a big deal out of clean and unclean food? That's part of the ceremonial law, right? So we don't need to worry about that. And the part that I always just point back to is, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Yeah. Just because it comes down to the question of, why do you think God said those certain animals were unclean in the first place? Why did he say, I don't want you eating these things? Do you think it was because they tasted the best, and it was like kind of this loyalty test where God was like, okay, I'm going to take the best tasting meat, I'm going to tell you can't eat it to see how much whether you're going to obey me, or whether you're going to
Garden of Eden.
Yeah,
don't eat that tree.
Well,
it's the best one.
I would say no, I don't think it was quite the same as that. But maybe we can go back and talk about that in a minute. But I don't think that's what God was doing with the meat. I think that when you look at the different animals that God says not to eat, you see a lot more meat that has a higher likelihood of creating disease, including heart disease, having parasites in it, if not properly cooked. And so you're looking at food that God basically said, this isn't going to be good for you. It's not going to help you live a long and healthy life. And so the question again is, well, has the purpose been done away with? Is this food suddenly not going to cause heart disease, not going to give you a higher chance of getting other diseases that you may not want to have? And I think the answer is no. And so that's one of the reasons why personally, for me, that I, outside of being an Adventist, wouldn't do it. I feel like God wrote the owner's manual.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to go ahead and trust that God has a reason behind it, and it's not simply just don't touch this because I said so.
Because I said so, yeah.
Which in the Garden of Eden, there is an aspect of that, but there's also an aspect of freedom that's involved with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's an aspect where Adam and Eve had the opportunity to choose whether they wanted to obey God or whether they didn't want to obey God. And there was an aspect of this was the one place in the Garden of Eden where Satan was allowed to have interaction with Adam and Eve if they chose that they wanted to have interaction with Satan. And so in that way, God did not fully restrict. He didn't say, I'm not going to let Satan get anywhere near you. You can't talk to him if you don't want to. But at the same time, God also limited it so that they weren't being pestered by the devil everywhere that they went. Yeah. Which the cool thing is that Jesus is pestered by the devil his entire life, and he remains sinless, while Adam and Eve had it restricted to one place in the entire earth, and they were like, let's try it out.
Yeah.
And so this is the thing that it's the beauty of God's grace, that God gives us the opportunity to make bad decisions if we want to, but he also does the loving thing of limiting that and caring about us. And then the beautiful thing is that God's grace covers where we do fall short, because we are selfish by nature.
Yeah.
By nature, we're selfish, and we, what Paul says, what I know I shouldn't do, I do. I know I don't want to do this, and yet I go and I wind up doing that. And this is his wretched man passage on what a wretched man I am. But then he closes off, but thanks be to God. Mm-hmm. Thanks be to God for Christ, for God's grace that covers my imperfections. And it's not an excuse to be unkind to others,
right, yeah.
But it is the opportunity to realize that when it happens, when I do what I don't want to do, that God's grace is sufficient.
Nice, yeah. Corbin said, why don't we celebrate Easter like, I believe you meant, the rest of Christianity? And once I had what I talked about earlier, and just realizing that Jesus rested on the Sabbath, I kind of feel like we do. I didn't used to feel that way. I used to feel like we were missing out. And now I feel like, man, this is a celebration on Easter Sabbath. I kind of like Easter Sabbath myself.
Yeah, and just different places do things different ways. We do have, here at Whole Life, we do celebrate Easter in the sense that we have a really big program on that Saturday before Easter. And one of the things we've been talking about is having a sunrise service. That's one of the things that we're interested in. Other churches I've been at, we've done things like that, and that's fully within what Seventh Adventists can do and have done. And I think it's a great thing to celebrate Easter.
Yeah.
And by celebrate, I'm not necessarily talking about hiding Easter eggs. I'm talking about actually celebrating Christ's resurrection, and whether that's the correct date when Christ rose from the dead is not as important as that this is a celebration, because we don't know when Christ was raised from the dead for sure, although we have pretty good guess.
Pretty good guess, yeah. What's it? Tito, would camp meeting be a festival we keep or celebrate to take place of the festival of the tabernacle? I laughed really hard when he said that, but also it turned into this whole thing. And if you don't know what camp meeting is, real briefly, it is a getting together of usually by state or sometimes by conference, depending upon how big your conference.
Almost always by conference.
But you end up with
church.
with the a lot of us have really good memories of growing up with camp meeting, where it was a whole week of friends and meetings, but a lot of free time to hang out with friends and learning about Jesus and hanging out with other people, like-minded people. And I was like, well, if we were going to create a festival, I think that might be we might need to bring it back, because we don't really do. We do camp meeting, but
there's a camp meeting up at Camp Colaqua that happens every year. There's actually several of them.
Is it really?
Florida Conference, yeah. There's when I say several, I think there's a couple for different language groups.
Oh,
and
yeah,
that's
true.
And then there's an English-speaking one as well.
That's right. Is it still a week? Or do they do shorter?
Ooh, good question. I think it's a long weekend.
Long weekend?
Could be wrong, but I think it's a long weekend.
Well, that's all right too. And then Mariana, haven't heard from you for a long time. And I know that they were just on a trip to Europe, and I enjoyed living vicariously through your pictures.
And I want to say that I was so thrilled that on their trip they were thinking of me, because they found Ken's nail salon and took a picture in front of it in Germany and said, "We visited your salon." I was like, "Oh, you found it."
Yeah, but that was a tightly held secret, but I guess it's out. She said, "My question is, if the purpose of the festivals were already fulfilled, why did God say they were supposed to be eternal?"
So I guess my question is, where does it say it will be eternal?
I don't know.
I'm not. Maybe when I'm reading the passage in Leviticus, I don't see that it says it's eternal. Let's see here. Yeah.
Well, Mariana, if there is a place that you found that, let us know, and we'll tackle that one again next week, just to make sure we get an answer for you. And then Cliff asked, this is our last question from Cliff, what happened to those who were resurrected when Jesus came out of the tomb? There seems to be no indication that I have seen.
Well, it's kind of a different direction than the...
So something in the message with all of this perpetuated that question.
So Adventist tradition, I don't think the Bible directly states what happens, but I believe within Protestants and Christianity, the part of the tradition is that when Christ ascended after 40 days, that they ascended with him as the first fruits of the resurrection. I believe that's the tradition, but if I'm open to be proven wrong.
Oh, well, there you go. So we have some possibilities for next week, guys.
I shouldn't say proven wrong. I would just say maybe just if I'm
misspoke,
misguided.
That sounds fair. So hopefully next week, I believe, if we're all upcoming with Hurricane Milton here, so you guys will hear this on Wednesday morning, and I think the last time I looked, we're Wednesday afternoon before the. A lot of the outer stuff gets here.
It looks like, the outer bands will probably start hitting us late Wednesday.
Yeah.
And then it looks like sometime early Thursday morning, it'll kind of come through here in the earlier morning hours. So we probably ought to talk about that for a minute. For those of you who are listening, particularly here in the Orlando area, just please take this seriously. This one looks like it means business, and it could be coming. Right now, the projection has been kind of jumping north and south a little bit. So right now, we just don't know. But what we do know is it looks like it's definitely going to impact Orlando
one way or another.
Yeah. And just plan for the worst. As there's those of you who've lived through hurricanes and typhoons. The worst typhoon that I survived was I think it was sustained winds of 150, 160 miles per hour with gusts up into the 190, 200 area. And that was on the island of Guam, that basically they build everything that is out of concrete and block there because they're used to having these things come through. And that was scary. It was super scary. And I just really want to encourage you, please, I beg you. We love you so much. You're a part of our family, all
Absolutely.
of you. If you're listening to this, you matter to us. Please listen to your local officials and do what they're telling you to do. If they're telling you to evacuate, please evacuate. Please do that. If they're telling you to stay inside, please stay inside. If they're, do what they're asking you to do. And we want you to hear more podcasts.
That's it. That's it.
So pay attention to that, and the storm should be coming through Thursday. Depending on the severity of the storm, we're planning on going ahead with services on Sabbath. The plan is, even if we don't have power, we would still have an abbreviated worship service here at the church. I'm going to, without having talked to anybody else, just go out on the limb and say that for sure that noon service, if you show up for that, we will have it. Now, again, I want to be clear. If the authorities are saying to not be driving around,
we're not going to ask you to come to church.
Not only will we won't have the service because we're going to follow whatever the local authorities are telling us to do. We don't want to put anybody in danger, and we don't want to get in the way of any kind of cleanup or crews that may need to be doing that. But if the authorities are okay with us being out and about, whether we have power or not, we will plan on having at least second service. Now, if we have power, if the storm goes past and doesn't create a lot of problems, then we will have church as scheduled. The other thing that I know that we're also looking at is that we may not be having that afternoon parenting seminar that's scheduled.
Right.
I need to confirm that with our children's ministries team, just to be sure, but I know that they were talking about canceling that. The other thing that I'm unclear about is the Ukrainian concert that's happening Saturday evening. I have reached out to the people organizing that to find out if they're planning on doing that concert still. If they are, we'll let you know. If they aren't, we'll let you know. So the big thing really to pay attention to, if you have power, internet, and cell service, which is a big if.
Yep.
If you have it,
charge those battery banks.
We will do our best to update everything on the website.
Yep.
And again, that is dependent on Randy and Lucas having power and the ability to get on the internet as well. We'll also do our best to send out text messages and text alerts. So if you haven't signed up for our texting service, now would be a good time to do it. And I'm assuming, Randy, you can put that in the show notes, how to do that.
That'll be in the show notes.
So do that. Look for emails. If you haven't signed up for our newsletter, now's a great time to sign up for our newsletter and our updates. And that's how we will do our best to communicate with you. We'll see what we can find for Randy to have emergency Wi-Fi, just because we need to figure out. We want you to know. But here's the thing: if you don't have power and the authorities are allowing you to drive around, then you can safely show up here at noon, planning on us having something.
Yeah.
If the authorities are saying don't drive, then please don't.
Yeah.
And we will worship in our homes.
That's it. Wholelife.church. If you go to the website, the front page will have a message there a little space that will be just for hurricane updates. Also, and again, that will depend on having that. But as long as I have a hotspot, and I think we'll be okay. And we'll try to keep those updated, because newsletter will come out on Wednesday, and then we'll text messages and the website. And we'll try to keep everybody updated.
The other thing worth noting is that the office will be closed Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Even if we're able to get in Friday, we're going to be doing cleanup around here, I suspect. And so unless the hurricane completely misses us, please just know that the church is going to be closed on Friday. If it completely misses us, then we'll be open. But I haven't
seen a model yet that takes us out of the equation. Like last time when it was like, well, this might miss us. Yeah.
So we will plan on doing cleanup around the church Friday if the weather allows and if the authorities allow us to be out for that. But please, unless there's a real reason, if you want to come help do cleanup, you're more than welcome to. But just again, follow what the authorities are asking you to do. There's so many different hazards after these kind of events, where there's down power lines, there's flooding that can happen in places you just don't expect. You get stuck. I heard about one person up in North Carolina who was trying to get away from they were trying to get in to another location there, and they got trapped in between like they couldn't go forward, and they couldn't go back because suddenly the river had risen. And so, in these situations, please it's just better to be at home until the authorities say it's safe to be out.
Safe to be out. And watch it when you go out the door. Last time, Irma, for us, we were on the east side, which is when we all know sometimes the most dangerous part being the tornadoes. And the tornadoes had come right by our house within a couple, maybe 100 feet, and took 9 trees, the tops off of pine trees. And everywhere I looked I could go up my side yard on the west side of the house, and I could see 3 downed power lines. If I went out the front of my house, I could see 4 places where the lines were down. And it's like, well, I think I'm just going to go back inside and just wait until somebody comes to make sure these are not live wires first. Yep. Even before we go and take an evaluation of what, neighborhood, check on neighbors, that kind of thing. So just be careful. We love you guys. Like Ken said, you're a part of the family, and we want you to be listening to lots more podcasts, worshiping with us online, in person. So just be safe, take all the precautions, and just check back, and we will do our best to keep you informed of what's happening. But it would be really cool to be able to worship, at least in some capacity, this coming Sabbath. So just stay tuned. And next week is small community.
Small communities is this Sabbath, and we'll be talking about that. So you may be in small communities one way or the other.
That might be it.
So that's coming up, and then after that, the Sabbath after that, we begin our Daniel series. Really excited about that.
So maybe what we need to do for the newsletter next week, in case we have small numbers this week, if something does go off, we may have to send out the link from YouTube into the newsletter so people have a chance to listen before we hit the podcast. So, all right, guys, please be safe, and hopefully we'll catch everyone next week. Thanks for listening, and man, just buckle down and stay safe.